Strong opinions, loosely held, is something a lot of people talk about
Right.
as a good way to hold opinions and think about things, and especially for people of high conviction,
Yep.
right? That seems to be the more evolved way of thinking, but there's a lot that goes into that, right? You could say that all you want,
Right.
but having those strong opinions, which you should, in the ideal way, those are earned opinions, right? It's earned wisdom.
Yes.
And then having the mental frameworks to be able to adapt those things over time
Yeah.
is really tricky.
Yes. Well, it's I don't know if it's tricky.
It's not as simple as you just say that and you're like, oh yeah, no, I'll just
No.
go have a strong opinion about everything and then change it all the time.
No.
It's like, well, that doesn't work.
It's indicative of your development.
Going down that road
Yes.
of development.
Yeah.
Right, let's start on the earlier side of things. So earlier on, right, on the early side of things, we have someone who could be described as loud but unthinking.
Yes.
Do you want to dive into that?
Earlier stages of ego development, loud and unthinking, is sort of the classic, I want it my way, please, 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 or whatever you want to say. But it's very self-oriented. It's very insecure. It's very defensive.
It's more emotional.
It's more emotional, and it's comes out of the insecurity associated with, deep down inside, you are unmoored. You don't know why you think the things that you do. You just know that you're emotionally triggered and you're reacting to the trigger.
You see the things that should update your worldview as threats
Yes.
rather than opportunities to correct
Right.
your way of thinking.
Yes. You're closed off from being open to growth. You're closed off to being open to changing your perspective. You're closed off to being open to questioning the things that, you believe in.
So what does that right, as a leader, what would that look like? Because I'm sure a lot of people have had a boss or someone they work with that falls into this category.
Well, I have a famous little story. It's probably, hopefully people will get it, but I had a boss like that when I first got out of school, and I'm going to use the term "it." Right, that boss was asked about. It was in the banking world, and that boss was asked about a particular account on a balance sheet called treasury stock, and her response was, treasury stock. That was her only answer. She didn't even know what it was. And
Not in the ironic, well, treasury stock, like, I should probably know this kind of thing, huh?
yeah, so it's just, it's just silly. But that's an example. Obviously, other examples are just someone throwing a tantrum. This got to be this way, and it's my way or the highway, and they're not even like willing to engage in a conversation about why they could be wrong. Because if they're wrong, then all of a sudden, right, they fall apart and they can't deal with it, and so there's just no listening.
Right, and the tantrum, I'm sure I'm not doing this 100% psychologically accurately,
Right.
but the tantrum is basically part of the ego fighting against that thing that is trying to update the worldview.
That's right. Yeah.
So, which- why that's a thing, right? It's
Yeah.
not just like, oh, that person's just difficult. It's like, well, no, there's something, there's a tension happening. There's a battle.
Yeah.
There's a South Park episode where Cartman's trying to, like, he's trying to be his mom's trying to get him to be a better kid.
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, she's pushing me too hard. And then he goes and tries to kill her.
Right.
And then he's just part of his soul is trying to escape because it's like conflict. He's like, I can't do this. Like, no, you have to do it. And it's like, and he's like having a tantrum, throwing up on the floor. And that's him trying to get that part of himself out of himself.
That's fun.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
weird story, but funny.
And you can look at this through the lens of, okay, self-awareness or others' awareness, right? Which is, let's say you're managing someone who throws a tantrum and doesn't want to just open up, right? And now the question is, do they, as I like to say, I'm not a magician. I can't help people get what they want. Now the question is, can you find a quieter time to engage in? Do you want to evolve? Do you want to become a better version of yourself, and sort of help them understand that maybe there is some opportunity for growth here and it'll be good for you.
Right, and you could start by picking out something, right? You'd want to break down the wall, the barrier there.
Yeah.
Find something that the individual is less personally attached to,
Yeah.
right? Take their opinion on something a little bit more periphery, and then let's get that evolving a little bit, and then from there you can move those things closer and closer to the actual core issue with that individual.
Yeah.
Assuming that you have a lot of time to do this.
Exactly. That's a whole nother conversation.
Right. And then so it is, and I think that that's valuable in terms of there are going to be people in your lives personally and professionally that you have a responsibility of caring for.
Right.
And in that situation, that's really useful. But then when it comes back to yourself, right, you are responsible for caring for yourself, right? You should treat yourself as someone you are responsible for caring for.
Right. Back to our 7 relationships. One of the most important relationship, if not the most important relationship, is your relationship with yourself.
So going back to that and trying to care for yourself, if you find yourself bothered in these situations and you want to move past that, you want to grow because, well, you want to be better, and be less of a burden on others, or you want to be a better leader.
Right.
Right.
Or you even want to be considered for a leadership position.
If you're here, probably you're not there yet, right? You got some room to grow.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be to somebody who is looking to grow from this stage?
They are looking to grow.
Yes.
So that's the
They
good
claim
news.
they're looking to grow.
Right. So, so then,
And this is going to be this is a one-to-one conversation here.
Yeah.
So there's no,
if they're
there's a
really
safe space in terms of
if
this
they're really
person taking
looking
this
to
in.
grow, I would have them look into understanding, loving yours or someone else's Gardner Cook's, sort of stages of ego development, and help them understand, why this is important if they want to advance, if they want to be able to work with other people, if they want to um, sort of, have a better relationship with themselves and others, right? This will actually be a really good thing. And then, of course, we could, it depends upon why they want to do these things. If they want to do these things because they want to become a leader, if they do want to do these things because they just want to have a better relationship with themselves, they want to have a better relationship with other people. I mean, this stuff obviously is not just about the workplace. It's about, their journey in life. And so hopefully you've done a decent enough job that they're willing to listen to you and start to lean into, okay, maybe I'll take advantage of the advice you're giving me. And then we can, as they've over time, right, we can help them understand the bigger picture in terms of leadership and, other aspects of what we're calling the integral growth theory, so that they can appreciate why all this makes sense.
I think that I would say the short of that is observe things. Don't try to impose your will on things as much.
Yeah.
Right. Understand it's like if you do find yourself in those conflicts, it's time to just sit back, observe, try to do that with less and less personal perspective on the matter.
Yeah.
And then you'll start to see things that are more universally true than others. And you can start working down those paths.
Yeah.
But when somebody is that and you do find yourself super confident because you have a reason for being confident in that, then lean in there. But don't defend things that you don't have a stake in.
Yeah.
Right. You're not going to win that battle. So then moving on to the next side of things, right? The defensive contrarian, which we've kind of touched on already, right? Viewing challenges as threats and reacting reflexively.
Yeah.
You tend to get a little bit more authoritarian here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the proximal advancement is that you're moving from being all about yourself to now starting to care about the group and the group's opinions. And, you sort of you're moving into that conformist stage now where it's really important for you to belong, and you're going through conflict with regard to wanting to be right? Wanting to be powerful and also wanting to belong. And so sometimes you can either over-index on sort of be fighting, being the leader of the group, or fighting with not wanting to upset the group. So the authoritarian side is, right, I'm in the group, I love the group, I want to dominate the group from my relatively unevolved perspective. And the conformist is just, I don't want to upset the group at all. And I just want everybody to be happy. Right. And I don't want people to challenge our group's worldview, because that's what makes us all love each other.
Take it back to a storytelling thing, right? If you look at any movie or book or TV show where there's a bad king,
Yeah.
right? The bipolar dysfunction of the king is the tyrant and the weakling,
Yep.
right? And that's the bad king is both of those. It is, since the king is weak, he becomes a tyrant because he tries to impose that weakness and sort of shelter himself from all those things.
Right.
Right. And it's like, look, I have power for the sake of power. And it's like, no, you have power. Your power is supposed to be in the form of capability and competency, so you can go help people and serve others and be a steward of the kingdom, not so that you can impose your will on things.
Right.
So, right.
Because people aren't going to, if you're not competent in doing what's for the betterment of the society, right, people aren't going to follow you.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, right, the king should be the most competent person for doing that job in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's a big hierarchy, right? So, but if you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling weak and you need to hit things, right? You need to beat your will into things like that, right? Don't be that king.
Right.
Don't be what's the kid from Game of Thrones? The Kid
Oh,
King, Joffrey, is that it?
yeah, Joffrey.
Joffrey.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't be him.
Don't be
Like that.
Joffrey.
Don't be Joffrey. So yeah, right. And
Yeah.
I feel like most people would probably think that being more of a conformist would precede the tyrant. They probably say, oh, it's softer, right? So that you should be getting more
Right.
and more strong-willed as you develop. It's like, well, no, you have this thing in you, especially if you have found yourself in a position where you're a founder or a
Right.
CEO. It's like you're probably pretty disagreeable
Right.
and a hard J for
Right.
Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you're going to be, when you're young, you're going to be judging things. You're going to be disagreeing with people for the sake of it. You're going to be a little bit argumentative. And that's going to be a good thing for you later on, as long as you continue to develop.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really cool about these conversations, right, and really understanding sort of the stages that people developmentally go through, is that depending upon the personality, right, each stage you'll test, right, the outer edges. Now some will like whoa and go test them really hard, and some will be testing them much more softly, right? But you are going to, the pendulum is going to swing during the stage so that you can experience the things that'll help inform you developmentally. So at each one of these stages of development, you are going to sort of have the tyrant moment a little bit, right? You're going to have the weakling moment a little bit. You're going to be afraid of, of losing your tribe, at the conformist stage. So, it's just part of it's why we go through the stages that we do developmentally.
And all these stages and all these things you have to explore, like are territories, basically.
Yeah.
Within your mind.
Yeah.
And a lot of some of those
They're not
territories
just
are gonna be
territories in your
easier.
mind too, the relationship territories, right?
Right. Yeah. But it's the mind that interacts with those things.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
have to reconcile that within.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that you have all these territories, and there are gonna be some things that you would rather explore than others, and some of them are gonna be really frightening for you.
Yeah.
And those ones that you have to be, it's a part of the journey,
Mhm.
and you can get lost there, and you can just spend your life on the edge of that scary territory, and that's not gonna do you any favors. That's not gonna do anyone that you're around any favors either.
Well, what percentage of the population across the globe tends to stay in the conformist stage? It's pretty significant.
60%?
It depends on whose research, but it's 50, 60%. Yeah.
And right, and at some point you're gonna sort of taper off on these stages, right? Most 99.99% of people don't progress all the way, right?
Yeah.
Which is, and that's not
It just is what it
That is
is.
what it is.
Yeah.
That's human nature. Right? You can't fight human nature.
Right.
But it is interesting, right?
Yeah.
You should want to continue to develop and do that for the sake of everything, right? But
But most
just
people,
understand how that your role within that work, right? You could advance through all these things, and
yeah.
doesn't mean anyone else is going to change,
Right.
right? In the ideal world, it's like, well, you start acting a certain way, you start shining a light on certain things,
Right.
identifying and resolving certain issues, and then that has little ripple effects. But that's all it is. It's
Yeah.
just you're shining a light,
Yeah.
and it's going to have a little bit of an echo to it. But at the end of
Well,
the day,
and it gets back to when we talk about levels of competency in terms of an organization, right? We got to remember, plus or minus 13% of the population, just cannot hold a job. And then another 40% of the population is really just genuinely happy getting a paycheck on Friday and spending it, over the next 2 weeks, and then getting a paycheck on Friday, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're happy, right? They've got their family, they've got their interests, and it's all good for them. So there's, you can say that everybody should, be wanting to sort of navigate the 9 stages of, development, if you want to use Lovinger's model. But we should also just recognize that a lot of people, this is good for them. It's okay,
yeah, and
right?
that's
I don't want to say no judgment, because obviously
yeah.
it's not for me, or you, right? But it's cool.
Well, I was saying that more to if you do find yourself in this thing, and then if you get to like you're 4 and you keep progressing, then you're like, well, you're gonna find yourself in a weird situation where you're gonna be surrounded with a bunch of people that aren't on that same journey as you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fine,
Yeah.
right? It's just like you don't lead because you want to have power over people.
No.
You lead because you want to serve.
Yeah. And it's a different version of, we don't make money because we want to make money. We make money because people value what it is we do.
So moving on from conformist
Yeah.
to you sort of gotten to that point where you take a step back, you're observing, you're trying to belong, right? You're trying to get into that group. And then now you're starting to develop a little bit more, you're carrying on that momentum, and you're getting a little bit of that informed rigidity back. So we would call us rigid but responsible. So you have more deeply held beliefs.
You're now starting to think for yourself, and you're questioning some of the things that your tribe, for lack of a better term, right, buys into. And so your worldview is no longer just the tribal worldview. It's like, hey, maybe I don't necessarily agree that, every single person in the other political party is a evil, human, for just to simplify it.
And you can mistake conviction for wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
which comes back to that Carl Jung quote, beware of unearned wisdom.
Yeah.
Which I think is huge.
Yeah.
Right. So it's great. Use that. But right, that's where it's like, that's not even a strongly held opinion. That's just a thing that's a little bit of a guide.
Right.
And you hold that loosely because you don't know, you got to go test these things out. And so you start to create things that are a little bit more controlled, a little more structured, but you can risk stagnation. So what would, at this level, what does that look like in the workplace? What does that look like as a leader?
Well, I think I've referred to this before. I think sort of the stage we're talking about right now is kind of like purgatory, right? Because you're just now beginning to form your own opinions, but you're still very much attached to your group. And so there's the emotional conflict between what you think and wanting to belong, right? And so for some stage, this stage is really hard. It could be a stage where all of a sudden you are kind of enabling, others, in that better, but you don't want to upset their apple cart. Bad metaphor, but whatever, right? And so you're kind of just stuck with sitting in this weird place where you're not letting go of some of the emotional attachments so that you can move your way into the next stage. And so I think stage 5 is a really like I said, it's purgatory, right? Because you do see the world a bit differently, but you're not willing to release the relationships that matter to you.
And you're at this point, right? Well, if you're listening to this or you are aware of the levels, then this doesn't really apply to you. But if you, right, we're 5 and 6, we're getting up to the point where you're just before you become aware of these stages,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
become aware of the journey. You're saying,
Yeah.
well, this is just how things are. And you're not able to,
Unless someone's
unless,
introduced it to you.
unless, right, someone's made you consciously aware of this.
Yeah.
Right. But when we get further down the line, you look back at your own journey, you're like, oh, right. And you start to
Yeah.
understand that that was all part of the journey. Like, oh, I was just an idiot 2 years ago,
Yeah.
kind of a thing.
And it's like, why didn't anybody help me understand this when I was at stage 4 or stage 5? It's like, oh, come on, man. It's like, what? It's part of what we're doing, right, with the company is we're trying to help people understand where they are developmentally, where companies are developmentally, because part of me is like, it's not that complicated, but we don't teach this stuff really well, in my opinion, in college. And I don't even know if
We
we
don't
teach
teach
it
it
well
well
in
in
business
college.
school. I never went to business school, so what do I know, right?
So I didn't go to business school. I doubt this is talked about at business school because people that come out of business school tend to be a little bit more rigid on things, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that personally, you just sort of intuitively understand, oh, you're on a journey, you're learning, you're getting better every day. Great, cool. But the business side, as that becomes really socialized, that's a lot more difficult because, like, well, this worked, and you're much more averse within a business. We're like, well, this has been working for a while and we've grown. Like, why isn't this working? We hit a growth ceiling. And it's like, well, what's going on?
Right.
And it's like, oh, so you got to understand where your business is in the journey.
Yeah.
But then you also need to understand where the people are in the business in their own respective journeys.
Yeah.
And all of these things have to be working as one cohesive organic system.
Yeah, because both developmentally as an individual and developmentally as a company, you got to go through these stages, right? And so, we talk about thinkers, feelers, doers, and critics. Another way of looking at these things is, I like Lexisney's. There's stabilizers. So critics are stabilizers, basically, right? So you do need to create stability at each stage to step off that step, right? You need to have stability now. So stability is important. So we need to go through these phases where we create stability, because without that stability, we can't take a strong step up to the next stage.
Yeah. And you have that solid foundation to jump off of.
Yeah.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
so I think if you relate it back to a hero's journey,
Yeah.
right? It's like, well, you start where you're comfortable, right? You start in the normal world, right?
Yeah.
The real world, whatever you can call it, right? And then you enter the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And right, you face challenges and you kind of get broken down a little bit in that journey.
Yeah.
And you go through a lot of things, whatever. And then you come out the other side integrating the things that you learned.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't just spend the whole time in the unknown.
Right.
Right. The hero's journey is not just you go from the normal world back to into the unknown and then you just grow there forever. It's like, well, no, you have to return to where you started from.
Right. And apply the
essence,
things that you've learned.
integrate those lessons and then return back to homeostasis, stability, whatever, right? And then you can begin another journey.
Yeah.
But if you don't do that, you're gonna break down and
it's
end up in purgatory.
Yeah, it's a forever cycle of, just, I don't want to call it chaos, but there's
That is what it is.
right? And there's no rejuvenation. Right.
It's like the pendulum.
Right.
If you look at
There's
the
no
pendulum thing
reflection.
again, it's like, well, if the pendulum just stays over here, well, that's not very good, right?
Right.
It's got to return.
Yeah.
And you're going to find yourself in it. Probably it's going to look like, right, this is lower stages, this is higher stages. It's going to go wider at first and start to slow down as that string gets smaller. And right as you just go to more incremental refinements on your built up, bottom up worldview.
Yeah.
So now
Mm-hmm.
getting into where the aware stages,
Yep.
right? Moving into 7 and so forth.
Yeah.
Right. You're open-minded, but you're still a little bit unanchored.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to see the bigger picture, but you're struggling to commit to it.
Right.
Because it's like a Dunning-Kruger kind of thing. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Yep.
So getting into that sort of thing is a good analogy.
Back to the original thing where strong opinions weakly held, right? At 7 now, we're really trying to chip away at the parts of our worldview that are still underdeveloped. Does that make sense? So that's the cool thing, right? It's now you have these foundations for understanding why you think the way you think, what works, what doesn't work, so strong opinions weakly held, but you still haven't gotten to where like on 10, you're pretty not on stage 9 at the top, right? We understand why we think the way we do. We're at peace with it. We don't understand everything, but we understand things well enough to have a coherent, explicit, resonant, unemotionally
I would say
conflicted.
trans-rational at that point, right? So
Yeah.
we move from emotional to rational,
Yeah.
and most people, it's like they get stuck around the transition between emotional and rational, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I never really thought about it that way, but right, it's like 3 and 4 kind of a thing. Um, and then once you move what at like 7, probably 7, right, you're moving into the trans-rational state of things where you're like, "Oh, yes, you get it logically, but there are also some things that you need your emotions and your subconscious to inform how you can make something explicit moving forward."
Mhm.
Right? Helping you identify what those things that you still have to work through are.
I always think that emotions are just signals from your subconscious, right?
Yeah.
And where you can't quite articulate it, but something's going on, right? And so when you're in 7, I think you're starting to better identify what the emotions are trying to signal, right? And so back to working on the edges of what you understand and what you don't understand, right? And you got more and more things that it's not necessarily understanding. It's more your worldview is more fully developed, but it's still got edges that are, not completely developed. And so there's some stuff out there that you're still working on. And so in 7, right, emotions, trans-rational, right? Okay, these are the things I'm working on. Back to strong opinions weakly held. And it's like, okay, I feel pretty confident that I have the right answer here, but maybe there is something I'm still missing because emotionally I'm like,
There's something unsettling there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So when it comes to leadership, right, what does it look like? This is probably most leaders out or most CEOs, I think,
Yeah,
are around level 7.
yeah. I think the whole ESG, DEI stuff, right? That's because I think that's where a lot of leaders were like struggling. So, yeah, I want to do the right thing. I understand, you know, I
You can
I
appreciate the
appreciate
intention
diversity,
behind it.
right? I appreciate diversity. I'm not being, when it comes to equity, and especially in a commercial enterprise where competency matters, right? I understand the big idea behind equity, but I also know that no, not everybody is equal and has the same pay and has the same level of drive and has the same level of competency. And so, there's
You're wrestling with
you're wrestling with that. And then in inclusion, right? It's like, yeah, we want to be inclusive, but we can't include everybody because there are people out there that actually are not good cultural fits, right? And I think we have very smart people running Fortune 500 companies that struggled with what DEI really was if you really wanted to be really firm about each of the words and, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so, and competencies are real. And there are hierarchies of competency, right? And no, we don't want to have a newborn baby be the CEO of a company. I mean, it's absurd when you take it to its edges, right? And so I think this is a really good example of the tension that existed, you know. And it's, obviously this pendulum swinging back on this stuff now, and I think people are starting to get more trans-rational about this topic.
and you still have other people that are just right. It's like, "Oh, well, that's not as big of a cultural push anymore, so just get rid of it." And
Right.
it's like, "Okay, well, right? Those are probably less developed people where it's like, oh, we needed this, let's do it. Oh, we don't need this, let's not do it. Like
Right.
there's not a lot of thought going into there,
Right. As
and they're not
opposed to
having
trying
that
to
uncomfortable
yeah.
dialogue in their heads,
Yeah.
right? Like, oh, what's like weighing the point?
Yeah. And why did the conversation begin? Right.
Yeah,
Because because there's a reason the conversation took place, and it's a good conversation,
and there
but it
were real
got
issues that it intended to solve
yes.
immaturely, you could say.
Yeah.
We could do a whole episode on taking those things and then running it through the framework. Like,
Yeah.
why did this happen?
Yeah.
And then what's to solve, right?
Yeah.
And it's something we've been talking about for a long time.
Yeah.
And right, what percentage? This is just completely guess kind of a thing. But what percentage of both general CEOs in the United States and in Fortune 500 CEOs would fall into this bucket?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer, but what my instincts are that the newer generation of leadership, of CEOs and founders who have built some pretty impressive companies or are doing pretty darn well. I think that group of people, especially a lot of the names that we know, are above 7. You know, I think there's a really interesting group of thought leaders that are coming out, and you listen to them on the podcasts, and whether it's the Andreessens or Colsons, or there's just a lot of really interesting people out there that I think are really sort of 7, 8, 9s, and the way model we like to use has 5 different categories, and so, but there's 7, 8, 9s, a lot of 7, 8, 9s. And I don't want to be an ageist, but I think you go a generation back, and you see a lot of 7s.
Yeah, I don't think it's ages to say that the older any individual gets, the more likely, or any individual slice of population gets, the more likely they are to be further along in their development.
Mhm.
But also, any successive generation is going to hopefully learn from the preceding generation's wisdom and be able to stand on their shoulders
Yeah.
and advance through things more fluidly.
Yeah. I deeply believe that.
Right. Yeah. So that's just the nature of things rather
It's the
than
nature of evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can't put, right, that's not a dig on anyone or any
Right.
generation. It's just like, well, that's just the way of things.
Yeah.
And I think right now we're kind of devolving a little bit. And I think it's more just a widening of like stratification of things, where you have some people that are just pushing forward, really learning, and then some people that are uncomfortable with the way things are, and then trying to seek comfort.
Yeah.
Right. Comforting things, social media, ideologies, all of that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be an interesting. The next 10 years are going to be interesting in that arena.
Well, I mean, this is kind of what Work 9.0 is all about, right? Is to help people understand this stuff that we're talking about right now, and see how I deeply believe that the next generation of leaders, and the current generation of leaders who just genuinely want to become better and better versions of themselves, need to be more evolved, in terms of self-awareness and other awareness, and, need to be sort of moving towards 7, 8s, and 9s.
So moving on to 8.
Yeah.
Right. Which is we're getting towards the upper edge of where, for practical purposes, where most people can get to audience wise and everything.
Right.
So now we're getting to more and the autonomous side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You're principled, which is a key word.
Yes.
Principled, not rigid.
Right.
But adaptive.
Yeah.
So you're more rooted in core values. You're listening to feedback. You're learning to discern good feedback from bad feedback.
Right.
Because I think that's a huge part of this, which probably gets back to level 4, 5.
Right.
Learning good feedback, or 5 and 6 probably. Learning good feedback from bad feedback.
Yes.
Which is huge. Right? When you're earlier on, it's like, just listen to everything. Like, you're going to just intake it all, and it will sort itself out. Because if you just take in everything, it's like, there's no way that you can just treat all that as fact.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to shed some of that off.
Yeah. So
developmentally, progression-wise, that's huge. And then focusing more on long-term things, right? Less, it's like the line of humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less.
I think back to the principles, we talked about if whether it's a combination of sort of you have your worldview is first principle based, and then your guiding principles, you, are sort of your why you do the things you do, why the company does the things it does, being really super clear on this is who we are, and these are the reasons we do the things that we do, and this is who we serve, and this is how we serve.
And there's a hierarchy there, right? Simon Sinek talks about that golden circle, why, how, what.
Right.
Like that's just a illustration of the hierarchy of principle, motivation, of all those things, right? What stems from what, and having that in the proper order will enable you to develop more smoothly.
Yeah, and to make
And
decisions more confidently.
and share that with the company as
Yes.
well, right? Make that explicit within the organization.
Exactly, explicit, coherent, and resonant, right? So you've evolved to the place where you can explain, back to strong opinions weakly held, or lightly held, or strong opinions, fairly strongly held, right? Because there are opinions that are fairly strongly held as well.
And there's all of those opinions, right? Is a tree with branches. The branches can move more than the trunk can.
Yeah.
And the trunk is what supports the whole thing. If you don't have that support, the tree dies, right?
Yeah.
The tree does that as it falls.
Yeah.
So understanding that, yes, there's going to be things that will redirect, but as you move up in the levels, your focus goes more from like observing, and then you might have to completely change trajectory on something, which you should allow given the proper input, to identifying the smaller pathologies and insufficiencies within both your framework of things,
Right.
and also other things that you see happening.
Yes.
Right. And you're going around fixing those things because for you, those are the areas of unknown that you have to go experience and go help with, right? That's what you have to serve.
Yeah, and part of your serving is actually bringing up people behind you that can take the torch, right? And they can also get to 7, 8, 9. And one of the things we haven't talked about at all today is if you want to get really super pragmatic on this, and I think, most people do really want to understand the super pragmatic side of this, is as you evolve, you become less and less subject to biases, recency
Yes.
bias, right? Recency bias, group bias, group thinking bias,
Personality bias.
personality bias. There's a list of God knows how many, right? I wrote something about 50, 70 different biases.
And you don't need to be consciously aware of all these biases,
Right.
but as you advance, you will be able to recognize when one of those is influencing you.
Yes. Or your people.
Yeah. And you'll also be able to recognize that in others.
Yes. Yeah. And so, and obviously to be really, really good at leading, right? Starting, building, scaling, leading an organization, the better we are at identifying biases and sort of taking those off the table, right? The more efficient the climb is.
You're moving to observing things without perspective.
Yeah.
Right. And the perspective is the bias.
Right.
And right, you have to do that in order to help other people do that as well.
Yeah.
And so what your relation, because you're doing this all in relation to others, right? And what your relationship looks like with those others at different levels changes.
Yes.
Right. Well, if you're really low, it's like, well, someone just thinks that you're some magical shaman type figure. If you're like a level 9, right, where level 2 is like, well, they're like magic, and that's great. And then it becomes more of than like a friend, like you just believe in them, to a mentor, to a guru to mentor, right? And then as you get closer, right, those relationships begin to change. But as you progress, you're more and more capable of helping.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation, which I've never, I don't think I've had it in my head, and I don't think we've had it, right? But, at what stage are you actually sufficiently equipped to recognize that you can't turn a person who's at stage 3 into stage 7? I mean, just the whole, right? It's impossible. They have to go through the stages. They have to have the steps. They have to have the stability of the step to step off of and up to the next step, right? And so at some stage, you recognize that you don't have the power, the ability to help someone move from stage 4 to stage 7. So if you have someone at stage 3, I'll go even easier, right? Stage 3, and you want them to act like a stage 6, be a stage 6 leader. And that's really important for that particular seat. You're like, I can't do that.
Doesn't work. And
and
that's not fair to that person.
it's not fair to that person.
It's not fair to the team.
it's not.
And I think level 7, you start to have that quarrel.
I think
And then
so.
level 8, you start to recognize, hey, I can't do this.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I think it is somewhere between 7 and 8 where you become at peace with this, right? And so you're not sitting here going, oh man, you're beating yourself up because, or you're trying to force something. It is what it is, and now you just have and it's hard conversation, and you probably don't even use the words that you don't apply because they won't understand. So it's just like, hey, it's just not a perfect fit here for what we need at this moment in time. And there's got to be, I'm sure whether it's here, maybe there's an opportunity in some other place within the organization where they're not in a leadership position, as an example, or it's just like, hey, where we are as a company developmentally and what we need, right? You're just not the perfect fit for this seat at this particular moment in time with regard to our developmental journey as a company. And it's hard, but you can't, right? You're not a magician. You can't just all of a sudden wish someone from, 5 to 7.
And if you try to skip, then you haven't built the foundation, and you're going to find yourself tumbling back down.
Yeah, and you're just going to be carrying them on your back.
So we're at time.
Yeah.
Strong opinions, loosely held.
Yeah.
Right. It's the opinion is just right. It's the principle, the value, the belief, and then the opinion. Right. It's a result of those things. So yes, the opinion is loosely held, but it's built on a strong foundation.
Yeah, and I think some people will have strong opinions early on, even at stage 3, right? And so as you work your way up, it's like we don't want you to not have strong opinions.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and voice those strong opinions.
Right.
But don't understand that that's just that opinion is just a gesture.
Yeah.
Right. And you could have a very wise leader who's like, I appreciate that, and I'm gonna go do something different.
Yeah.
But that communication is huge.
Yeah.
And so you should always be communicating these things.
Yeah.
And have the courage to do that. But don't have attachment to the outcome.
Right.
Appreciate the journey you're on, the process of development, but don't have any attachment to whatever that outcome is. All right.
All right. Thank you.